like I said, the article that Brother Arian was referring to is Article 2, and as I mentioned, America violates Article 2 as a matter of policy. If you look at the entire Cold War period, so-called Cold War period, from the time of the establishment of the United Nations, the whole premise of the Cold War period was the fight against communism, which was to determine, in other words, the United States wanted to be able to determine what kind of a government any given country would have, whether it was Vietnam or Indonesia or the Philippines or even Italy, even their so-called allies in Europe. They wanted to be able to determine what kind of a government any country would have. And they still want to determine that until today. We've seen, it may be controversial, but if you have followed, America's, modus operandi, then you would recognize that even what just happened in Bangladesh was a color revolution against the government of Sheikh Hasina. And as I mentioned before, and I've talked about it a number of times, and I've had the honor of being on panel discussions with Dr. Alan Bosek, talking about the situation in South Africa with the Democratic Alliance and so on. Even the fact that they have an organization called the National Endowment for Democracy, which is nothing but a front organization for the CIA, specifically for the purpose of fostering regime change in country after country after country. Just the fact that they have an organization like that can go into foreign countries, that can go into countries all around the world to foster opposition groups and support opposition groups so that they can try to get their parties, the parties that they sponsor, the parties that they support and that they fund, so that they can get those into power in this country or that country. This in and of itself constitutes a violation of Article 2 of the UN Charter. They violate it as a matter of policy. This is their entire approach to foreign relations, is to try to interfere with the domestic political situation and political determination of any country. They believe that this is their right, and this is what they have been doing. And the only thing, this is the really important point here. It's not that they just have the power to do that, and so they do it. What gives them the power to do it is the impunity and unaccountability that they're able to enjoy when they do those things, and they're only able to enjoy that impunity because they dominate the United Nations. I've seen people in the comment section expressing very familiar, very common skepticism and pessimism, saying things like international law is a joke. Well, that's what they have made you think. They taught you that lesson because they have been able to act above the law. They've been able to act with impunity for, again, nearly 8 decades. And the only reason that they've been able to do that isn't because they're that powerful. It's because they have been able to control the only international body that is charged with the enforcement of international law. It's just like in those old cowboy movies, those old Western movies, where you have an outlaw who comes into a town and becomes the sheriff. And he's still an outlaw, but he has the tin badge, so he gets to do whatever he wants. And then that makes a mockery of the law. Well, that's what the United States has been able to do. And the tin badge that they have is represented by their position on the Security Council. It's represented by their funding and their domination of the United Nations. So if you can expel America from the United Nations, well, you'll knock that tin badge off of their chest, and they won't have the impunity and the unaccountability that they have enjoyed for 8 decades. And it will be a completely different power dynamic in the world. Because America simply doesn't have the power that they used to have. That's a fact. They don't have the power that they had when the United Nations was first established. And now, at this point, they desperately need the United Nations. And I'll give you an example of why you can understand that that's true. Because of what Sister Iman said earlier. I think she said that they have invoked the veto power something like 14 times. Is that right, Sister? Just in the last couple of years?
In the last 2 years,
in
14 times, yes.
14 times. Well, what does that tell you? That tells you that they're losing control of the rest of the world. They have invoked the veto power 14 times in 2 years because they have had to. Because that means that they are getting further and further and further away from the global consensus. That the rest of the world is turning away from them. And that the only thing that they can do to try to maintain their power and to maintain their control and maintain their ability to dominate is by invoking the veto power. Because everybody is turning against them. So they're actually losing their power. They're losing their ability to coerce by other means. So increasingly, the United Nations is important to them. And also, we were talking earlier about the fact that they had withheld their funding up until it was necessary for them to veto a ceasefire. And then suddenly they came up with the funds and paid the United Nations what they owed them so that they could veto the ceasefire. So we see that international law isn't a joke. If international law was a joke, then America wouldn't need to find some mechanism for giving them impunity and unaccountability to international law. The same goes for the United Nations itself. If the United Nations was a useless or impotent or unimportant or powerless institution, then America would have no interest in controlling it. But the very fact that they've been able to control it is exactly what has allowed and enabled them to magnify and amplify and exaggerate their power. And without their control of the United Nations, they won't have that power anymore because their power comes from their unaccountability.